All right, very good. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. It is Thursday, March 25th, 2021. It is 7:32 a.m., and this is the virtual meeting of the Edina Housing and Redevelopment Authority for this date. Before we call the meeting to order, this 25th day of March, there's a few things that we need to cover due to the governor's Stay Safer at Home Minnesota order and to ensure the safety of all residents and staff. All members of the HRA staff and presenters are participating from their homes or offices. So there's a few things, as I mentioned earlier, we'd like to cover. Today, the only chance we'll have for public participation is on community comment. We do not have any public hearing matters scheduled this morning. And so when we get to that point in the agenda, and you can jot this number down now if you're waiting to comment, 800-374-0221. The conference ID number is 309-0935. You'll be given 3 minutes to speak. Our executive assistant, Jennifer Garsky, will time the speakers. She'll let you know if you go over the 3-minute mark, and then you need to wrap up as promptly as you can. We ask that we avoid redundancy if possible on comments, but certainly everybody's opinion is welcome. So thanks in advance for your patience as we work through running these meetings online. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do with all these folks working from other remote locations. All right, so let's call the meeting to order, and roll call, please, Ms. Garsky.
Commissioner Anderson? Commissioner Jackson?
Here.
Commissioner Pierce?
Here.
Commissioner Staunton?
Here.
Chair Hovland?
Here. Next matter on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. I'll rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, at least that second flu shot didn't mess that up. So I could remember that. We've got a meeting agenda in front of us that's been published to the public as well as to the commissioners. Is there anyone that wishes to modify the meeting agenda? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve the meeting agenda as shown.
Moved.
Second.
Commissioner Jackson moves. Commissioner Pierce seconds. The adoption of the agenda is shown. Any further discussion? Roll call, please, Ms. Garsky.
Commissioner Jackson?
Aye.
Commissioner Pierce?
Aye.
Commissioner Staunton?
Aye.
Chair Hovland?
Aye. The meeting agenda is approved. Next, we're going to go to community comment, and now we'll hear from residents who would like to speak about something that's not on today's agenda or scheduled for a future public hearing. Again, 800-374-0221 is your call-in number. The conference ID is 309-0935, 309-0935. Press *1 to speak. An operator will put you in the queue, and I think Director Benarott will bring you into the meeting. Director Benarott, or is it Ms. Garsky that's going to handle all of that? I think Ms. Garsky will be doing timing again, but Jennifer Benarott, are you with us today?
It's actually me, Mr. Mayor, Dan Riesig, filling in for Jennifer. We do
All right,
have
thank
one.
you, Mr. Riesig. Go ahead.
We do have one caller on the line. They are not in queue yet. That may be due to the delay, so I would say we wait a minute or so. Again, if they would like to speak, to hit *1 to get into the queue.
All right, we'll wait for you to determine whether the person wants to speak to the HRA commissioners this morning.
It appears that that caller is actually disconnected, so I believe we are okay to move forward.
All right, good. We'll move forward to the next portion of the agenda. And that is the adoption of the consent agenda. There's only a single item on the consent agenda this morning. That's the minutes, draft minutes of March 11th, 2021. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Commissioner Jackson moves, Commissioner Pierce seconds the approval of the consent agenda. Any further discussion? Roll call, please, Ms. Karski.
Commissioner Jackson,
Aye.
Commissioner Pierce,
Aye.
Commissioner Staunton,
Aye.
Chair Hovland.
Aye. The consent agenda is approved and adopted. Now on to reports and recommendations. We've got two matters in this portion of the agenda. Stephanie Hawkinson, our Affordable Housing Development Manager, has the first topic, and that is a potential change in the multifamily affordable housing policy. Welcome, Ms. Hawkinson.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now.
You did a nice job on television the other night as well. Thank you for representing the city well.
Okay. I am here again to propose two changes to the multifamily affordable housing policy. For a little bit of background information, we adopted the policy in 2015. In 2018, we added the buy-in option. In 2018 later, we strengthened it with that any developer that's building a new multifamily development would have to affirmatively market the units, and they could not discriminate against Section 8 voucher holders. And then we've been adjusting the incomes annually. So currently, with the ownership aspect of the policy, when it was first drafted, the cap on ownership was ran parallel with the Minnesota Housing Startup Program, which is a first-time homebuyer program offered by Minnesota Housing. And that was the same level, the same cap that was being used by the Come Home to Edina program. So when the Come Home to Edina program increased their cap to 425, the policy at the time we had it raised as well, because the two were aligned at least with that number. Over time, however, we realized, this was always in the policy, that it really pertained to multifamily affordable, and the Come Home to Edina program raised their cap to adjust for increasing in pricing for single family ownership, and that when looking at multifamily ownership, 425, it's hard to say that that falls in the line of affordable when you're talking about condos and co-ops. Furthermore, we agreed to a goal that was established by the Metropolitan Council to add a certain number of affordable housing units in the city by 2030, and that number is 992. But with ownership, they will their cap for ownership is 293,500. So if we had a condo project or a co-op project that was approved, and we had the limit for affordability at 425, and they complied with the 425, we could not count those units towards our affordability goal. In talking to other cities, their ownership affordability level does align with the Metropolitan Councils. Second part of the amendment to the policy is our buy-in amount, and I have been before you a few times about this, and the Edina Housing Foundation voted on both these matters, and they support both, is to increase it from $100,000 to $125,000. Unlike what was proposed to you last summer, we do not have an annual increase built into this. It's at $125,000. There are a couple reasons for this. One is the cost of development has increased dramatically. For example, the 4100, the Sound on 76th project being developed by Aon, they have already had a change order for over $500,000 due to lumber. The forest fires out west, the tariffs in Canada, the freeze in the south with resin that stopped resin production, cost of development has increased pretty dramatically. So the buy-in of $100,000, it is a much more appealing option for developers of multifamily to just do the buy-in rather than include the affordability. And I think our intent is that we really want to incentivize them to include the units rather than just opting for the buy-in. Another reason for this is when we looked at comparable cities, on the chart here, I show that our current buy-in using 4,500 France as an example. Granted, they included some units, so I just used that building as an example. If they were to do the buy-in option, it would have been, under our current policy, $500,000 that they would have bought in. Under the proposed changes, it would be $625,000. Bloomington's, using the same building as an example, the buy-in would be $630,000. Portland, Maine's, $500,000. So same with what we have now. Highland Park, which we often use as our comparable, would be $625,000. Lake Forest, Illinois, $877,000. Evanston, Illinois, $1.3 million. Some cities don't have the buy-in option, but I just did some research to try to find somewhat like cities and what that did have buy-in to see a comparison. So again, the rationale for this is that we do have goals. I put 994, it's actually 992 for creating those many units. So I think we really want to make sure that the developers, that there is some sort of incentive to include the units rather than take an much easier option of buying out. So it increases the disincentive to do the buy-in. And as I said before, the construction costs are increasing. And that is it for my presentation.
Questions for Ms. Hawkinson? Comments?
So,
Yes, Commissioner Jackson?
thank you. This is just a comment, but I want to stress that we talk about climate change and the costs. Here's a perfect example of the costs that we are having to incur because of climate change. Those forest fires seem like a long ways away, but here it is today in Edina, Minnesota, and we're making a policy change in response to the cost of climate change. So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you. And thanks, Stephanie. This is a good presentation.
Other questions, comments? Yeah, Commissioner Pierce?
Yep, just one follow-up. I think it makes a lot of sense to increase the buy-in. The only question I have is if contractors do opt for the buy-in, and based on your spreadsheet, I think it was it 4,500? France would have been 625, something like that. What do we do? And this is a longer term question. So what do we do with those funds to keep progressing towards our goal?
Commissioner, Chair, we have been using the buy-in funds to try to further different affordable housing goals where there are not another suitable source of funds. They are part of our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. They feed into that. So currently we are in partnership with Homes Within Reach, and they are seeking single-family homes for ownership and buying them and placing them in a land trust to make opportunities for ownership for lower income households. We use the buy-in funds for that program.
Okay.
4D to try to do an energy efficiency and incentivize owners of multifamily that are currently affordable but not mandated. We have a program to help with that. So we use these funds to help further affordable housing through a variety of different mechanisms. A lot of it is what I said at the last meeting, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing which sticks for enhancing affordability. But these are the funds that we can use to do that.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. I asked because there is, in the community, I think it's easy to kind of take the buy-in option and for people to interpret that as though we're kind of letting the contractor off the hook of their commitment to provide affordable housing. And on the surface, that can be true, right? That definitely is an issue. But I think if we're telling both sides of the story, that we're taking these funds and we're able to use it to further our goal, I just think it's a better story to be able to tell if we can still show that we're progressing towards our goal. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Pierce. Commissioner Staunton?
Just to piggyback on that notion, Stephanie, can you kind of elaborate a little bit on this drop in the acquisition limit from 425 to 293? It seems to me, as a practical matter, there is not probably a single family structure in the city that you could acquire for 293. So how does that factor into our objectives here?
Chair, Commissioners, the policy pertains to multifamily, so of 20 or more units. And because we are a pretty built community, it is unlikely we're going to get a swath of land where a developer is going to be able to build 20 or more single-family homes. So you're right, that number does not bode well for single-family, but it's for condos and townhomes and co-ops. And so I think if we have a condo or co-op development, and they're going to include the affordable units, and the affordable units are priced at $425 plus their association fees, I think we're hard pressed to say that those are affordable in a multifamily ownership situation, and we couldn't count them towards our goals anyway.
And so, in terms of making single family homes that are more affordable anyway available, we do that through this housing trust fund and
Go ahead, and I'll close it for you.
funds and the rest that we've been talking about. And it's the whole continuum of affordability, right?
Chair, Commissioners, yes, indeed. For single family, single family is not included in this particular policy. So it's off. It's a different track.
Right,
and then
I
yes, we
understand
use the buy-in funds, and we come up with other mechanisms to push forward the single family. The Come Home to Edina program is still around, and we'll still be working towards that as well.
Yeah, so I think going to Commissioner Pierce's comments in terms of our larger strategy, this is a piece of it, but we have some strategies for single family, and they might use some of this buy-in money to achieve those objectives. Okay.
Yes, correct.
Thank you.
I still need a little bit more detail around this topic that Commissioner Staunton has just talked about. So if we think about it from a multifamily standpoint, that it pertains to, let's say, twin homes, duplexes, townhomes, co-ops, condos, what exactly does that figure 293.5 mean?
Here, Commissioners, it would not pertain to duplexes and fourplexes. It pertains to developments that contain at least 20 units. So they're a bit larger developments, and that is the sale price of those units, and that equates to serving households at 80% of area median income.
All right, so that part I track with, but it's the realization, I think, and maybe not specifically, but just generally from doing this work over the years, that I think we'll be hard pressed to find anybody that can do that, can accomplish that, even though we have this laudable goal. So is this where the subsidy then comes in to get them to that number? How does this help us?
Chair, Commissioners, Minnetonka, when they developed their co-op recently of 80 some odd units, they did have 10% that were affordable at this level. The project did use TIF for land acquisition, so it's either, and as is written into the policy, how we try to achieve this goal is through density bonuses, possibly height variances, parking reduction, so helping save costs, and it may also require some subsidy. Okay. We first look at how they can cut costs or increase density, and then if it the numbers don't pan out, then we look at, and again, this is for the ownership side, not the rental side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, understood. All right, and then let me go back up here. Yeah, the 80% of area median income, I think that's a wise thing. Still uncertain about the buy-in. I don't know. I'm uncertain as to what the unintended consequences. Every time we have this conversation about increasing the buy-in, I'm always uncertain as to what the market effect of that will be. And so, we've been able to use this money. Maybe we can't use it in the same way we've had distinctly affordable housing projects, but it has served an essential purpose. And I'm just trying to figure out whether this is an inducement level where people will put projects right in the development itself, or whether we're still going to be having people buy in, or we might have people deciding, or developers deciding they're just not going to develop any Edina because the costs of the buy-in are too high. Everything else, all the costs are too high, and this is just exacerbating their cost factor, and they just decide to pass us over and move on to the next suburb. So I'm really sensitive to this buy-in number, and I wish I had both better objective and subjective feelings about it, or objective information and subjective sense about it. I don't, and I just don't know what to do about it. So I think we're better off comparing ourselves to cities in our own area as opposed to going down to Illinois, where the landscape, I would think, would be quite a bit different. And so it's for us to match up with a city in Illinois. I'm not persuaded by that, but I might be persuaded by what I see in our own region, so that we make sure that we're not chasing off development by constantly increasing the buy-in number. And then, because then that has a dual effect. We lose the housing and we lose the opportunity to use the money on the buy-in to do some other things that we think are important to do. So I just need more confidence around that, and I have to get that confidence from you, I think.
Chair, Commissioners, a lot of the other cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, St. Louis Park, they don't have the buy-in option. So finding comps other than Bloomington is challenging. Some of them do have stricter inclusion requirements, and I do know that has been a challenge. And we have been questioned about why we do have the buy-in option when a lot of our neighbors do not. And I think, it's been articulated on why, because the difference between market rate rents and affordable rents in Edina is greater than it is in some of our neighboring communities. So including the affordability in some of these market rate developments, it's a greater hit on the bottom line. As it were, they can't make as much because the rents are just that much lower than the market rate rents. So that's one thing that our neighboring communities don't confront. And I guess I can't foresee how it would affect the future other than the fact that currently, in the current environment, Edina is an appealing place to develop. And I think the option to do the buy-in right now is becoming far more appealing than including the units, just because of cost of construction and the delta between a market rate and affordable. So I'm trying to both increase the pot for the trust fund as well as adding a little bit extra disincentive to not include the units.
Okay. Well, I think you've raised one interesting point for me, and that is that in some of the other cities where they're seeing some significant multifamily building, like St. Louis Park, their obligation there to the development community is that you need to put the units in. There's no buy-in. So I have liked the idea that we've had some other source of funds to do some other things that we think are important. And I'd like to make sure that continues.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Commissioner.
just on that point, I think one of the things that is worth noting here is if you look at the end of the draft policy revisions, there's a list of times that we've revised this policy since we first adopted it in November of 2015. And I think it illustrates that it's been an iterative process. I mean, this is kind of the price of leadership, frankly, is that it's hard to find comps because you're trying to set a new path for people. And my view is we're doing this based on good data, and if it turns out to be a barrier, we can always revisit the issue and revise the buy-in amount if we need to.
Yeah, you've raised an interesting point there. I was thinking about that earlier, that we haven't adjusted it for a while, and we have had some inflationary costs. Why we continue with those import restrictions on lumber from Canada in view of the situation we're facing, I don't know the answer to that, but that's a different sort of question at a different level of government. But I'm a cautious traveler on this, but I think I can be comfortable with this idea of changing the buy-in to 125. Commissioner Jackson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Your question prompted a question from me. I know that one of the concerns that I've heard raised in the community is that our affordability is for 20 years. And I'm thinking about, we've got, build units that are affordable for 20 years, or buy in and buy units that are permanently affordable. And I wonder in our policy consideration whether that should be part of our consideration, or do we want to have that as a balancing factor here, that when we get buy-in, we can create permanent affordability, and whether that goes into our consideration of the amount of money. Does that make sense?
Chair, Commissioners, at some point, I mean, you can reconsider the term of the affordability period as well.
Yeah.
And we have, in fact, because we started, I think, at 15 years and we changed it to 20.
Yeah. I guess I just don't have any sense of the importance of the 20-year versus permanent, or can you, Commissioner Staunton, would you tell me a little bit more of the history of that and the considerations?
Well, when we started with the 15, again, we were kind of the leading edge and thinking, well, that's a long time. Then we started to realize pretty quickly after that 15 years goes by in a hurry. If somebody had done something in late 2015, they'd already be 9 years from not having to have it be affordable again. So we adjusted that, and I think we can continue to adjust that. But as Ms. Hawkinson indicates, that's going to need its own analysis in terms of what the consequences are, et cetera.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. So I think Ms. Hawkinson is requesting that we adopt a motion to approve the proposed changes to the new multifamily affordable housing policy. Is there a motion to that effect?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Pierce. Motion by Member Staunton, Commissioner Staunton, second by Commissioner Pierce. Any further discussion? Roll call, please, Ms. Karski, with respect to the motion as stated.
Commissioner Jackson,
Aye.
Commissioner Pierce,
Aye.
Commissioner Staunton,
Aye.
Chair Hovland.
Aye. The proposed changes are adopted. Thank you, Ms. Hawkinson. And now we're going to go over to Nick Anhut from Ellers, who's going to talk about various financing tools. I don't know, Manager Hawkinson, if you had some introductory remarks before Mr. Anhut starts his presentation.
Sure, and I'll be brief because I am conscious of time, and we may have to split this presentation into two and have a carryover because of the time allowed. But we asked Nick to provide us with a toolbox of various financing options that would help support affordable housing. And so this is what he has presented for us or created for us.
All right. Thank you, Manager Hawkinson. Mr. Anhut, welcome.
Hey, good morning. Thank you, Chair. Board members, Nick Anhut from Ellers and Associates, and I'm going to share a presentation with you, which should be coming up in just a moment. As Ms. Hawkinson mentioned, to provide some backdrop and information about various financial tools available to HRAs in Minnesota. So we plan to just go over a brief overview of reviewing why there is a need for public financing to step in and play a role in developing affordable housing, various forms of roles, and a menu of tools that are available. And then along the way, if we have questions, we can talk about various examples of how they've been implemented. First and foremost, the need is driven because the private financing market is fairly limited. Banks and other providers have underwriting and loan-to-value standards that apply to all projects regardless of the end use. And these private developers and private participants have market-based returns in mind when they choose to invest their dollars. And so when we typically see a project come forward, we'll expect that they'll lever about 60 to 80% of the total cost within a mortgage or some kind of loan financing, put down cash or other equity to cover the remaining 20 to 40%. And then in some special cases, when there are circumstances with extraordinary costs or other items, they may receive other financial assistance to bring forward their market rate project, typically in the range of 0 to 10%. However, when you talk about an affordable housing project, we're talking about something where there's a desire to restrict the amount of income that that project can generate in order to keep it affordable for the occupants who can live there. That reduction in rental income basically goes against the financing mechanism that the private market is seeking to obtain. It creates a lower potential to secure the size of mortgage that's necessary for the project, and it also provides less attractive returns on that equity investment. And the result is what is commonly referred to as gap. As far as public financing options, there are basically two different buckets that we can use to help fill that gap. It can be filled upfront with direct dollars injected into the project in the form of grants or other type of assistance. And then we can also look at ways of trying to fill that gap over time, inject an additional cash flow source that can help secure that mortgage to provide enough revenue so that they can mortgage enough to build the project, or in other cases, some kind of a guarantee that if there are shortfalls in the future, there's a ready funding source from the public entity that will go ahead and fill up to a certain level to make sure they can meet those coverage requirements. So a lot of numbers on the screen, but we wanted to provide some kind of an example of a market rate versus an affordable project. Typically, an affordable project, you will see that the rental income, again, is suppressed intentionally in order to maintain that affordability for the occupants. However, we typically see that the costs in these projects are the same. The cost of constructions that Ms. Hawkinson just alluded to in the prior presentation apply to all developments, regardless of their affordability. That constraint on rental income creates a gap in the form of the maximum mortgage that the project can support. And that trickles down directly into some quite large numbers in many cases. It also might impact whether or not an investor wanted to inject enough equity into it as well, if there's not enough of a cash flow to provide an adequate market return. HRAs across the state play various roles across the spectrum. There are more limited options. We're open to the concept of certain affordable housing and redevelopment objectives, but little in the way of public incentives, all the way to the other side of the spectrum, where there's a much more proactive approach to public participation through policy, through using funds to acquire sites and prepare them in the hope to attract certain developers to build the affordable housing. Here is an overview of all of the different tools that I plan to discuss. I understand, in the interest of time, we may not get to all of them, but if you do have questions along the way, I will pause in between and be happy to address them, but otherwise, I'm going to plan on just firing away. The first two that we wanted to talk about are the ones that are most prevalent as far as active use from HRAs, and that is the use of tax increment financing and tax abatement. Both of these tools are fairly similar, but they have some nuanced differences. As far as tax increment financing, a working definition is the ability to capture and use most of the increased local property tax revenues received from a new development or a significant redevelopment, and within a specific geography, a defined area. As far as abatement, the key differences for abatement is instead of most of the taxes, it's actually the individual property taxes received from a city, a county, and a school district specifically, subject to their approval, and the ability to capture potentially all of the taxes related to the property and development, not just the increase in taxes. To go over sort of the mechanics behind this, if you imagine a vacant site or perhaps a spot for redevelopment where there's going to be a significant increase in density, prior to that development, there is a piece of property that has a value called its original tax capacity, and that tax capacity is part of the local jurisdiction's tax base. When you adopt a levy at the end of the year for the next year's tax collections, that levy is spread over that tax base of which this parcel or this property, in theory, is contributing. When you use TIF, that base value stays within your tax base. Those funds continue to flow to the local jurisdictions to meet their operating needs. When we're talking about abatement, there is the potential that each local unit can decide that not only do they want to capture the increase in the future, but they can also abate this original value up front and use that as a revenue source to assist the project in question. So when the development comes forward, a developer constructs a property, they build upon that original tax capacity, and they create new tax capacity that can generate additional revenues. Again, that original tax capacity, the vacant site, those taxes continue to flow to the jurisdictions over the site, but that new increase in value is which provides the impetus to collect additional revenues to assist the project. To just give an example of how this might flow over time, you'll see in this chart, we've got the base tax capacity at the onset of the development that continues to flow to the local city, county, and school district throughout the term of the creation of a TIF district. However, while that TIF district is active, any increase in value above that base, those taxes are segregated and remitted separately to the HRA so that it can be used to assist in developing that property. Properties within a TIF district or an abatement area pay exactly the same total property taxes as any other like development or property within the community. It's where those funds go and how they are remitted that is the change within a TIF district or an abatement area. And there are certain property taxes that are excluded from this calculation, namely the state and fiscal disparities taxes that are applicable to commercial properties. And then for all properties, a school operating referendum is actually a separate levy that is spread over all property and is not captured by tax increment or abatement. In addition, as I mentioned, for tax increment, the base value taxes, the taxes that apply to the vacant lot at the start of the development, are also not captured. They continue to go to each of the local jurisdictions, the taxing authorities. In the case of an abatement, one of the changes from tax increment is that each of the city, the county, and the school district can choose to participate or opt out of that abatement. And so each one of those entities potentially could decide not to contribute their resources toward the financing the development. And in which case, in this example only, we see that the revenues associated with the school district are not included within that captured amount. Again, they could if that board decides to contribute them, but abatement relies on each one of those jurisdictions to make that determination for themselves. As far as how these tools can be used for affordable housing, tax increment has very specific affordability restrictions that are imposed within the statutes, which I will go over those. But abatement actually does not have any affordability criteria. The project itself must meet what's called a public benefit for the community. A variety of different benefits in the form of providing additional tax base, providing new opportunities for services, new employment. These are the types of public benefits that abatement can be used for, and obviously affordable housing can fit within those criteria. As far as the use of the revenue, as I mentioned in the previous slides, TIF captures only the increase in revenue, and it is all of or most of the additional tax revenue generated from a property, whereas abatement, you could potentially go all the way down to capture the base value as well, but it is dependent on each jurisdiction deciding to contribute their share. As far as limitations, there are no limits to the amount of TIF districts that you can create or their size. The TIF itself has to serve the affordable housing or other objective that qualifies under the TIF Act, but there is no limitation to how large a development could be potentially or how many TIF districts you administer. As far as abatement, there is an annual limitation that the city is only abating taxes up to 10% of its net tax capacity. And that is an annual figure, and it's actually quite significant for the city of Edina due to the size of your tax base. As far as the length of time that these tools are available when you do create a new TIF or an abatement, for housing, TIF can be up to a maximum of 26 years. For abatement, you're capped at 15 years if each of the 3 school, county, and city participate in the abatement. However, if one of those entities opts out, then the abatement can continue for up to 20 years. And that is a maximum. Obviously, you can go shorter than that based on the circumstances and the development need. The last key difference is in managing the funds and reporting. Tax increment is highly scrutinized at the state level. There are numerous bills every year to change the TIF Act that are proposed to the legislature, and it does require a certain level of reporting to the state auditor on an annual basis. Any funds that are remitted back to the HRA are kept in their own segregated accounting. Whereas abatement is really up to the local jurisdiction to adopt a policy and choose how it wants to administer those funds. Again, you are, in the form of abatement, you are actually choosing to contribute your own tax revenue. So it is very similar in many respects to just your general revenues that you receive on an annual basis and budget for. As far as restrictions, I did want to highlight specifically within the use of tax increment that the affordability requirements. So for rental housing projects, these follow federal guidelines that are set for at least 20% of the units included in an assisted building must be restricted for occupancy at 50% of area and median income, or 40% of the units restricted at 60% of area median income. For owner-occupied housing, whether it's a multifamily condo development or if you're actually talking about a single-family home, The properties that are generating the TIF and being assisted must meet similar income limitations, but they only apply to the first owner of the property. For a family of 2 or less, it must be at 100% of median income. For a family of 3 and above, at 115% of median income. And then in the case that you're using other TIF tools, such as establishing a redevelopment TIF district where there are blighted properties or substandard buildings that need to be cleared, or a soils district where there's contamination underground that needs to be cleaned up, you can also impose affordability requirements through policy when you do negotiate the terms of assistance for using those tools. The HRA would have flexibility to set within its policies what those affordability criteria would be in order to qualify within your own policy for receiving public assistance. As far as how you use these tools to finance actual development, there are two main buckets. Again, these are tools that are predicated on the ability to capture revenue over a long period of time. So none of these funds come up front to the HRA. The property actually has to be built, pay in its taxes, and generate that revenue over a significant period of time. So one main form is what's called a pay-as-you-go note. This essentially is a promissory note from the HRA to the developer or the property owner that says, as long as you build the property, as long as you generate the tax revenue from this development and include the affordability requirement that Edina requires, then the HRA will promise to use a portion of those future TIF or abatement revenues to reimburse a portion of your development costs. This places all of the risk on the developer to build, construct, and finance the project up front, but they know that they've got a promise from the HRA in their back pocket and are able to leverage that in many cases for additional mortgage dollars or even a subordinated loan from another banking institution. On the flip side, the city could incur some of that risk on itself, or the HRA for that matter, by issuing bonds for the project or using some funds that it has on hands and issuing a loan with the intent for that loan to be repaid by the future tax increment or abatement revenue. Again, these do carry a little bit more risk as you are actually putting money up front or incurring some liability for the development to actually sustain itself and continue to generate taxes. But it can be quite meaningful as well in terms of filling the gap. And can be mitigated to some degree by requiring the developer to provide some form of guarantee to backstop at least a portion of the risk that you would potentially be providing. One last bit about tax increment financing is the ability to pool revenues that are generated from one project and use them for another. So the projects within the TIF districts need to qualify under the affordability requirements, but in some cases you may generate more revenue within that TIF district than you needed to commit in order to build that development. And you are still able to use the additional revenue that's generated to assist other affordable housing needs throughout the community. There is no limitation to the amount of pooling that can come from a affordable housing TIF district. There are some limitations when you're using other tools like redevelopment TIF or soils that I mentioned earlier. But these funds can be used to fund direct project expenses. So if you do accumulate them over time, you could use them to acquire property elsewhere in the community and set it aside for affordability or write down those costs. You could use it to install infrastructure that's going to serve another affordable housing development. The caveat is that wherever you're using those funds, it needs to assist an affordable housing projects that meets the criteria that I mentioned before. You can also use it to assist a developer in their financing, very similar to that pay-as-you-go note structure that we mentioned before. perhaps using it as a loan for the project or a cash flow note that is intended to be repaid from the project revenues itself and could be potentially deferred. Again, the projects and the use of the funds, the expenditure needs to go towards assisting affordable housing in order to use this resource. Use, and as I mentioned earlier, use from a non-housing TIF district is limited to various percentages, and so you would have to abide by those limitations in your annual report. I think we may have time to cover one more slide, given your timeline, and I just wanted to touch on another tool, which is the ability for the HRA to levy taxes on the city and its tax base. These are potentially the most flexible revenues that the HRA could have and apply. They can be used for not just affordable housing, but also for redevelopment objectives throughout the community. They are able to be used for operations, to engage in studies. If you wanted to use it for capital outlay and infrastructure, they could be used for that as well. They can be used to pay debt service or supplement debt service for other bonds issued, not just backed by the levy, but maybe backed by other sources. And it can be a source to inject capital for revolving loan funds. There is a cap on the amount that the HRA can levy. It is defined within the statutes, and it's quite large within a city of your stature. Currently, the HRA is levying $230,000 per year to assist in paying for a lot of the programming that you provide. And it could potentially be increased if there were an additional desire. However, just be advised that that would incur an additional tax increase for everyone. So certainly a balancing act as you move forward within the community. And I'll look to you, Mayor, on whether I need to stop at this point, and maybe we'll revisit this again in the future.
I think either we decide to collectively to stop, or I can jump off, and Commissioner, it's not an action item, so Commissioner Staunton could finish up running the meeting, and I defer to my colleagues, I guess, but I'll have to jump here in about 1 or 2 minutes. If you, Nick, let me ask you this: how many more slides do you have to go? And Stephanie, could we take this up at the next HRA meeting and finish it off, and then have questions at that point in time?
Mayor, Chair, I think that would be my preference if Nick is amenable to that, only in that I would prefer the more commissioners to see this as possible. Yeah, Nick, is that okay with you?
I am available for a future meeting. I don't know the schedule for the HRA, but I definitely could attend a meeting in April and continue this conversation there.
That would allow Commissioner Anderson to be involved as well and participate in questions.
Yep, I agree. Okay, is there a motion to adjourn? Thank you, Nick. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Does anybody have any quick questions first? I guess I should ask that. Otherwise, we can entertain a motion to adjourn. Member Jackson moves to adjourn.
Second.
Commissioner Staunton seconds. Any further discussion with respect to potential adjournment? Roll call, please, Ms. Garski, with respect to adjournment. And then, Ms. Garski, I sent you a note in the chat. Would you make sure that Mr. Anhut's presentation gets sent to all of the commissioners?
Yes, I will do that.
Thank you. All right. We got a motion and a second. Would you call roll on that, please, on that motion to adjourn?
Yes, Commissioner Jackson.
Aye.
Commissioner Pierce.
Aye.
Commissioner Staunton.
Aye.
Chair Hovland.
Aye. We stand adjourned. Thanks, everybody. And I'm sure we'll work back on this, on the Senate hearing here. So I'll talk to you soon.
Good luck.
Yeah, thank you.
Good luck.
Okay.
See you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.